Hello and welcome to episode 27 of The Elephant in the Room with Bradley Devlin. I, of course, am Bradley Devlin. Thank you for joining us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Play, or in the video format on YouTube. If you are watching this on the video format on YouTube, you will realize that my background is a little bit different than it usually is, and that is because I am in my cabin in Tabernash, Colorado, enjoying the beautiful country that God has blessed us with. And you know what? I know the lighting isn't good on my face, but I think you'd much rather see the natural splendor behind me. Maybe you'll see a moose or some cattle or maybe even a fox or a deer walk on by behind me. So I'd rather have bad lighting on my face so that you could see those beautiful views. And next week we will be back in California, so you'll get to see my face a little bit better. I could have had the nice lighting, natural lighting on my face, but you'd see my dirty kitchen in the background. And I don't think that that's necessary. I think you'd much rather see these beautiful mountains behind me. So with that, let's jump right into Bradley's breakdown. We are going to be talking a little bit more about the iconoclasm and the unrest in the country that has been going on since, of course, the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. And last week, we took a break from focusing on that to focus on the Supreme Court ruling in the Bostock case that was written by Justice Gorsuch, because I believe the effects of that ruling will long outlast the current unrest in the country. But this week, of course, as I said, we are returning to the unrest across the country because it is indeed important. And not only is it important due to the effects that it will likely have on the election come November, but it serves as kind of a temperature check on the culture. So while I said previously that the Supreme Court rulings are likely to have a longer lasting effect than the unrest happening right now, the unrest you're seeing is likely a stepping stone to a culture that is even more corrosive, even more self-destructive than it is right now. And as Andrew Breitbart said, politics is downstream from culture. And a toxic culture breeds toxic politics, which only compounds our country's and our nation's problems. And as Andrew Breitbart would always say, politics is downstream from culture, and a toxic culture breeds toxic politics, which only compounds our country's and our nation's problems. And it's important to differentiate between the two. A nation is the group of people that share aspects of identity and culture that come together to comprise a country, to comprise a nation state, right? The country is more centered on the state, on the governmental arm of society. Patriotism is allegiance to the country and the state, where nationalism is typically an allegiance to a people group. And in a world centered around nation states, these things often go hand in hand. Obviously, nationalism commonly predates patriotism, and of course, there are horrible iterations of both of these isms, right? Both nationalism and patriotism. Those horrible iterations emerge when there is a toxic culture, because the poisoned culture is perceived as a threat by the state and by interest groups in the state. And that conflict that emerges from this tension never benefits freedom or human flourishing. Take early 20th century Russia, for example, Germany in the late 20s, early 30s, the breakup of Yugoslavia, even going all the way back to the collapse of the Roman Empire or the ancient Chinese dynasties. History is riddled with these kinds of examples. And this is what I fear about the direction of our culture. That it incentivizes both Democrats and Republicans to be more freewheeling with exercises of governmental power. A great example of this has been the debate over Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, right? When it comes to social media platforms and comment sections on various websites and search engines like Google and the curation of those search engines, right? Charlie Cook of National Review joked that Section 230 was one of the only good things Congress has passed in the modern era, and naturally, both Democrats and Republicans are now against it. Josh Hawley might be enthusiastic to surveil and regulate the actions of social media corporations and set up the requisite mechanisms to do that. But what then happens when Elizabeth Warren is the person in charge of directing and overseeing these executive agencies? What happens when she has the keys to the kingdom? And the answer in both cases, right, whether it's Josh Hawley or Elizabeth Warren, would be less speech. And in the latter case, right, with Elizabeth Warren overseeing these agencies, most likely no speech for anyone to the right of Susan Collins. Maybe even Susan Collins is caught in the trap established by Elizabeth Warren. So let's look at where our culture has gone wrong. I know upon hearing that you might think, where the hell do we even start? and we will have plenty of opportunities in the future to discuss every twist and turn in culture, whether that's historically something that we're revisiting on the show or something that happens in current events and happening contemporaneously. But now I want to focus on the past few weeks. An incredibly vocal minority group in our culture is escalating their aggressiveness. They are increasing their level of violence, and they are doing these things in order to force those who are generally sympathetic to the purported causes, right? Racial justice and values such as equality, right? These classical liberals maybe, or Democrats that are sympathetic to these values. And they're going to force these mainstream left-wing Democrats into a religious adherence to the worldview that underpins this radical leftism. And when you submit to the mob, you're allowing the mob's mentality to creep increasingly into the mainstream. You are beholden to their whims and their decrees, and that is why when people are describing something as mob rule, it's never a good thing, right? It's never a positive thing. And this is exactly what we've seen out of politicians and corporations and the media in the midst of this cultural revolution. These institutions, right, the commanding heights of our society, have allowed the radical mob to run wild in the wake of the tragic murder of the unarmed black man, George Floyd. There isn't a strong logical connection from the incident involving George Floyd, not even a strong logical connection of police brutality as a national issue, to tearing down statues of Ulysses S. Grant, of Abraham Lincoln, that commemorates the Emancipation Proclamation, for example. You saw people saying that they want to tear that statue down, of George Washington, of Father Junipero Sierra, of Teddy Roosevelt, or Christopher Columbus. But the mob has declared that the connection exists, and thus it is so. And anyone who dissents to this type of unending iconoclasm is not just no longer part of the cultural tribe, right? That cultural tribe, that cultural mob. They're an enemy. They're evil. They're racists, they're bigoted, and they must be destroyed, even if they believe George Floyd's murder was a tragedy, like I do, that police brutality in any circumstance is a problem, like I do, that it disproportionately affects black Americans, like I do, and that the legacy of historic racism in this country remains a problem. And to a certain extent, I agree with that as well. And you can see just how unsustainable this is in real time, how untenable it is to the maintenance of a free country and a free society. Just look at what has happened in the former Chaz, now CHOP. Immediately after it was established, right? After CHOP, then Chaz was established, policing was being performed by bands of warlord-type thugs. Borders with walls and enforcement mechanisms were established. Those with power used force against dissenters and speech they believed was in opposition to their interests. They've justified vigilantism, including property theft and assault against any one of those whose their allegiance to Chaz or CHOP was under question, and even enforced intersectional segregation. Only after some folks got shot did the mayor of Seattle say that this must come to an end. But before that, right, from the establishment of warlords and the borders to the establishment of segregation in Chaz or CHOP or whatever the heck they're calling it now, the mayor believed that this was simply just an exercise of the freedom of assembly. I mean, here is a perfect example of another lefty bending the knee to the Stalinist mob. And what happens when you completely cede the ground to the mob? When you see people praising or passing off videos of relatively privileged white folks berating black and Hispanic cops, or white members of Antifa taking down statues of immigrants who have done a great service to this country or Western civilization, or privileged members of the media or our political class justifying looting and rioting of minority-owned businesses or places of employment for people of color as anti-racist acts, and this in any way, shape, or form makes a shred of sense to you when they do this, you have already drank deeply from the well of wokeness. Self-hating, virtue-signaling elites are promulgating the belief that America is a horrible and evil and racist place, and that we have to erase all confrontational parts of our history in order to excise the final vestiges of these societal demons, even though we've taken multiple steps in order to excise these demons already. Donald Trump was mocked by John Oliver when he said that he worried about the slippery slope that follows iconoclasm, that eventually they will come after George Washington and the founders. And the only response John Oliver had to this assertion is that iconoclasm will stop somewhere. But 3 years later, it seems as if Trump was more correct about this than John Oliver. Those advocating for iconoclasm today in America believe that the American experiment was a horrible, irredeemable mistake, and that it must be removed root, stem, and branch. And yes, while iconoclasm may stop somewhere temporarily, it will reemerge in the future to tear down the members of society today that will be venerated for their accomplishments by future generations, right? It's exactly what happened in the summer of 68. We're revisiting the summer of 68 in 2020. And this is only going to come to a stop if everyday people, if Americans like you and me, stand up to these absurdities. Stand up to protect the heroes that did their best to protect us in their time. Make persuasive arguments on the merits of venerating figures in history who have complicated legacies. As conservatives, we know that man is not perfectible, and we ought to be able to recognize that people who do our nation a great service deserve our collective gratitude, despite their imperfections and failings. And we have to maintain a public square where both the positive and the negative aspects of a historical figure's legacy can be parsed out and not simplified using whatever buzzwords are created by the left. Let's move to privatize some of these statues and monuments that are the most controversial, such as statues honoring Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee. Let's preserve that history so that we can tell it to our progeny. Let's move these monuments to museums that offer a holistic picture of these figures' lives and the period of history that they lived through, and the good things and the evil things that they did. Let's try to ensure that taxpayer dollars, specifically the tax dollars of African Americans, aren't going towards the maintenance of statues memorializing efforts to keep blacks enslaved and subservient in the United States. We can do that. And we're doing an awful job of that right now. We're doing an awful job finding the difference and the balance between good people who do bad things and bad people who do good things. Certainly the former deserve a place of esteem in our history and culture, right? But the hard truth is, in some cases, depending on the size of the good thing done by someone in the second category, they may also deserve acknowledgement or praise. I'm not saying that because Robert E. Lee gave a lot to education that we need to memorialize Robert E. Lee as some benevolent, good historical figure. That's not what I'm saying. It's that depending on the size of the good thing done by someone who can be considered as a bad person, we might have to acknowledge that they did do a great service to someone or something. And the cultural revolutionaries of today, with their French revolutionary-like zeal, are trying to tell you that every figure in American history is a bad person who may have done some good things, and thus no one in this category deserves our respect and appreciation. In their mind, presenting a holistic picture of the complicated parts of our history causes some to fall under its sway and become white supremacists, for example. And that's why groups of people who have taken up this cause historically have ultimately ended up restricting the information others have access to. They don't just tear down statues. They burn books. Because if the message of a statue, or Aunt Jemima, right, can lead people to white supremacy, so too can the messages in literature and history books. The attempt to simplify and dumb down history doesn't bring us closer to a more perfect world. Instead, it condemns us to repeat our history's mistakes. I'll leave you with this quote from Oscar Wilde. Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. Before we get to howl about that, I have to tell you about YAF. Yes, Young America's Foundation, their National Conservative Student Conference happening August 3rd through August 8th, 2020. Yes, Young America's Foundation's signature program is now approaching its 42nd year. The 42nd annual National Conservative Student Conference will educate and inspire college students with the principles of individual freedom, a free market economy, a strong national defense, and traditional values. Students hear from policy leaders, authors, and activists who cover a broad array of topics just blocks away from the National Mall and our national monuments, and learn the best way to stand up for and advance conservative ideas on campus just in time for the start of your fall semester. Now, YAF is aware of and currently monitoring the COVID-19 pandemic, and at this time, the foundation is hopeful that we will be able to continue this program as planned, and YAF will communicate any changes here and with participants via email. Check it out on yaf.org/events/NCSC. That's yaf.org/events/NCSC for more information on how you can attend the National Conservative Student Conference. All right, now it is time for Howl About That. This is when I take a lone conservative article, give it my own spin, and give you the synopsis, and encourage you to go check out all of our content over at loneconservative.com. Get access to the article that I'm talking about right now, which is going to be Hooters and the Supreme Court by Nick Samarco, who is a student located in Boston, Massachusetts. Go check out his stuff, as well as all of our content from contributors around the country and even around the world. We have some lone conservatives internationally as well, so keep an eye out for their contributions. So let's get into it. Hooters and the Supreme Court by Nick Samarco is responding to the surprise ruling from Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch that we saw last week in Bostick versus Clayton County. And Gorsuch sided, of course, with the court's progressives and decided that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act protects employees from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, Nick Samarco doesn't deny that the legal protections for LGBTQ Americans are deserved, but that's not the question at hand, right? The question at hand is whether or not the interpretation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, specifically Title VII, does provide those protections, and Gorsuch's ruling has some serious consequences for Americans and American businesses, and this includes the controversial restaurant chain Hooters. The argument from Justice Gorsuch is that an employer cannot base a hiring or firing decision on the basis of the employee's gender identity or sexual orientation, and Samarco addresses the broader implications that it has on business owners. Hooters is a restaurant chain that is infamous for the attractiveness of their female waitstaff, right? Tradcons have gone after Hooters for years, and maybe they have some tasty chicken wings and beer, but no one is remembering the wings. They are remembering something else, and you might find it in the name. In 1997, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of two men who were turned down for waitstaff positions because Hooters prefers to hire females for their waitstaff. Now, Hooters argued that they should be exempt from federal discrimination policy when it comes to exclusively hiring women over men, as their primary business model is sex appeal, not chicken wings, sex appeal. Hooters settled that case out of court, and though they invoked the bona fide occupational qualification exemption in the Civil Rights Act, Samarco points out the problems this may have in the present day. Gorsuch's sweeping decision did not discuss exemptions like this at all. As Samarco points out, even though a large part of Hooters' brand is having beautiful waitresses, hence the motivation to hire women over men, the Supreme Court's ruling makes it so places like Hooters are now doing something possibly illegal. Now, Samarco notes further implications that may result from this ruling, such as the discrimination of sex-segregated housing and professional sports. He argues that the court should have dismissed this case and said that this is a legislative matter fit for Congress to decide. And Samarco affirms that LGBTQ protections are long overdue, but Gorsuch's argument is not only sloppy, but will have long-term implications for businesses as well as religious and secular Americans alike. And yes, this is the problem, as we discussed last week, with legislating from the bench, is you leave a lot of things unanswered and only encourage and incentivize more litigation, which only increases the amount of legislation coming from the bench. Certainly an interesting and thought-provoking take from Nick in this column, and make sure to keep up on all of his stuff, all of his weekly columns on loneconservative.com. All right, now it is time for the Warrior of the Week. This week we are recognizing Florida's 1st Congressional District Representative Matt Gaetz. After a heated debate between Gaetz and Democratic Congressman Richmond during a hearing on the Justice in Police Act, Gaetz had revealed on social media that he had a Cuban son. And he explained on Twitter that, for all those wondering, this is my son Nestor. We share no blood, but he is my life. He came from Cuba, legally of course, 6 years ago and lives with me in Florida. I'm so proud of him, and raising him has been the best and most rewarding thing that I've done in my life. In an interview with People magazine, Gaetz said that his relationship with Nestor was defined by love for each other, not by any paperwork. Now, leftist critics came back to attack Gaetz for supposedly attempting to use his son as political leverage and questioning Gaetz' sexuality. so woke, so accepting the left is, right? Unbelievable that they would go in and question whether or not this kid came to live with Matt Gaetz because he was trying to sexually traffic him, or that it was some sort of gay lover. It's just absolutely vile, disgusting, and very, very bigoted stuff. Various politicians did come to explain and defend Gaetz' decision to maintain Nestor's privacy. Now, former Florida State Representative Jose Felix Diaz explained how Gaetz stepped up after his mother had passed away, and former California Representative Katie Hill, you know Katie Hill from all of her sexually related scandals, came to defend her unlikely friend when questions about Gaetz and Nestor came up. And that was a very surprising thing, in my opinion. It definitely surprised everyone on social media, but good on Katie Hill, right? Give credit where credit's due. I don't think Katie Hill is particularly a great person, and you don't necessarily want her at your back. You don't necessarily want her backing you up when it comes to issues of sexual impropriety. But here, totally respect Katie Hill for coming forward and stepping up for Representative Gaetz. Katie Hill even went on to explain how Matt Gaetz talked about Nestor more than anything else, and how he has done so much for his son and is truly a proud dad. She called the Free Nestor movement BS. She also explained how he was trying to protect his son from the political environment, and that Nestor made his own choice to enter the spotlight. Gaetz managed to highlight how race shouldn't be a determining factor in having a broader conversation on justice. He also confronted the left about their hypocritical standards when it comes to issues of race and sexuality, and defended his family and his family values. Gaetz explained in the same People interview that my work with Nestor, our family, no element of my public service could compare to that joy that our family has brought me. Congratulations to you, Nestor and Matt Gaetz, and also respect to Katie Hill. I can't believe I'm saying that, but that does it for this episode of The Elephant in the Room. Make sure to join us next week, where I will be back in California, and we will have another episode to you Thursday. Thank you for being flexible with me as I explore a little bit of the great country that God gave us. See you next time.